All right, I think we've got enough time for a very quick review of the whole story. Very quick and very abbreviated. Yeah, everything's going fine this time. We're looking at a hybrid Zervanist Mazdaist story. Zervan is the one and the all, and a chaotic coincidence of all the opposites, light and darkness, good and evil, male and female, bliss and misery, order and disorder. And Zervan is eternal and lives by, in, and of itself. And in that state, it gets lonely and it wishes for a son. And he sacrifices. He sacrifices his creative powers for 1,000 years, but without success. And toward the end of that 1,000 years, he begins to doubt the efficacy of his sacrifices. When the 1,000 years comes to term, Zervan's wife, who is actually part of his whole androgynous being, gives birth to 2 sons. And the son who is the product of the love and the desire and of the sacrifice is Ormazd. And the son of doubt and uncertainty and insecurity is Ahriman. The doubt and having it, and then having it manifest in the being of Ahriman, produces a kind of fall for Zervan, because henceforth he goes into the background and is unseen and unworshipped, and all of the attention is given to Ormazd instead. Ormazd is all goodness, all light, all life, without any blemish anywhere. And Ahriman is cold and dry and dark and evil. Zervan is thinking inside of himself, as things are just about to come to birth, that he will give nothing to Ahriman. His intent is instead to give everything to Ormazd, but Ahriman, being dark, reads the dark thoughts, and he thrusts himself or kicks himself out of the womb first, and he claims, by right of primogeniture, he claims the rule of the cosmos. Zervan, on the other hand, is horrified and exclaims, as everyone does when they try to make their dream come true, "It never works out the way you thought it would." It says, "My son is light and fragrant, but thou art dark and stinking." So, for the time being, Ahriman must rule the world, and will do so until his time runs out. Got to be lots more story here. We told part of the story before when we first began with Mazdaism. We said that even though the Zervanist story has Ahriman active right from the beginning, the total story has Ahriman in a state of waking up. And he wakes up to a point of light, and he starts rebelling. And as he rebels, he casts himself into a trance-like state, into some sort of deep sleep for the second quarter, the second 3,000 years of the full 4-quarter, 12,000-year cycle. And when he awakens, he comes out with terror. and the big war begins. On one side, there are Ormazd and Amshishpentas, the spirits of God who have different functions in the visible cosmos and different glories in the spiritual cosmos, and they rule different parts of nature, and they rule different periods of time and the activity that takes place in those periods of time. They're called Amshashpens in Zurvanism and Mazdaism, and they are served by Izzards, a class of 28 and a class of 3 Izzards. The class of 3 works only with humans. And then there were all sorts of genies and Paris and Yazeras and all kinds of beings, Fravarshis and nature spirits of all kinds, divinities of all kinds, all serving the good and all serving the building part of nature. Opposed was Araman and his chief Deva, who was called Akumano, and was shortened later to Az, or Az. And Araman opposes Ormazd, and all of the Devas oppose the Amshashpens. In fact, they're almost exact reflections, only where one is good, the other is evil. And there were all sorts of female demons, and then there were Peris that were negative, even though they appeared positives, and then there were dark fairies and yatus and false priests and all sorts of people, and they constituted the 2 hierarchies that fought each other in the Great War. Ormazd brings the world to a final perfection, and in it, for his crowning act, he produces vegetation and fire, the fire of life to give the vegetation life. He produces the primal sacrificial bull or an ox called Gosh, and finally the Adam Primus called Geomart that represented the perfect man. About this time, Araman, who has been knocked out in outer darkness, is awakened by the cosmic whore named Jeh, J-E-H, and as he awakens, he's sort of hung over, and true to his nature, he is dark and despairing, but the rest has given him enormous power, a power that is almost equal to that of Ormazd, and they set out to a back and forth fight that takes up the whole third 3,000 years. And when he bursts out of outer darkness, he first thing he does is attacks the sky and bursts it open. Something like, I would imagine, a great hole in the ozone layer or something like that. And then he plunges toward the earth, and he tunnels a hole through the earth, and he comes out the other side and enters the primal waters on the other side. And all of this ripping and rending of the heavens and of the earth opens it all to disorder, and he produces darkness. And this is when he does a lot of his counter-creation. And finally, he turns all of his destructive powers on the prize creations of Ormazd. He kills the vegetation, and he douses the fire. And finally, he kills the great ox Gosh and utterly destroys Geomart. And about this time, he knows better than to hang around, and he's just about to sneak back into the void when Ormazd catches him and has him bound into time. So he is now bound in space by his basic nature, and he's bound in time by his actions, his destructive actions, which allow Ormazd to tie him in. At this time, a lot of the divine beings and nature beings are being born just to help Ormazd. And what they do is they repair and they regenerate the earth. And Ahriman is eventually tied down and weakened to an extent that he has almost no power left. The corpse of the ox becomes fertilizer for the earth, and Geomart becomes the essence that the whole line of kings comes out of. There are 7 pairs of couples that are autothonian, that they spring out of the earth, where the blood of Geomart soaks it. And Ormazd tells them that they are the masters of all in the world, and that they have been created perfect, and that they should only think what is good and say what is good, and do not worship the devas, but they have free will to choose to not do so if they want, because when they choose to serve Ormazd, Ormazd wants it to be in freedom. Their first action was to say, wow, all of this is beautiful, all of this is good, and then they looked at each other and they said, behold a human being, and they rejoiced in that. And then the first action that they took was to walk. After walking, they began to eat, and as they ate, they said it was Ormazd who created everything, the waters, the earth, the tree, the ox, the stars, and everything. Then Ahriman comes along, and he tempts them with the worst of all sins, a lie, and they believe it, and they repeat the lie, and that is that the lie that Ahriman created everything. In short, materialism was it, and then they fell from grace, and then the devas were able to tempt them into all of the other sins and all of the other evils. And for a while they are even sterile, because their children, when they brought them forth, they ate them. Eventually, after they repent, Ormazd causes them to be fertile again, and that's when the 7 sets of twins are born, out of whom all of the kings come. And the kings work together with Ormazd, and this is when they surround Ahriman, and they overcome the forces of evil, even though there are all kinds of earthquakes, and the sun and moon and stars fall from the sky, and the Mazdaists claim that Ahriman is bound up and is made weak, and the Zervanites claim that Ahriman dies, and there's a mutual destruction between Ahriman and Az. And what follows then is a golden age in which everything becomes beautiful, and even the dead are freed and resurrected, and all of this is brought about because Ormazd never stops repeating the Holy Scripture, and the power of the spiritual creative word ultimately leads to victory, and the darkness is vanquished, and it is a great period of heavenly existence. All right, now we're set to do the last little bit of interpretation. The next time we meet will be the last time for the year. And we're going to try and do a little bit of Manichaeism. And we're going to talk about one more kind of dualism and then try to unify everything in a way that we can experience. We're not going to dwell on the subject, but pretty much we're going to pick up where we left off last time. What we're trying to do and have been trying to do for 2 years now is being locked in a world where there is a lot of evil and where we see it all around us, by trying to see how it originated and where it came from and how things got off key. Through that, we're trying to understand how to live lives of goodness and how to improve ourselves. In some minds, the worst kind of evil is war, because the destruction and the hatred and animosity is general. It's worldwide. It isn't just like a petty fight where it's one person against another, but it's an outright war of everybody against everybody. And moreover, it's impersonal. It's a personal enemy is somebody we know and somebody we may dislike, and we dislike them because we see them for what they are, even if it's our own projection. But we're intimately and closely associated with the enemy, and we see them for what they are. In war, it's different. It's more impersonal. The animosity is toward an entire society or an entire political or religious system. There may be some individual enemies or rivals, but not so much. It means that all the hatred and warfare are based on an impersonal kind of ignorance, that a outlook that differs from ours. We have not personal experience with it, but we have an impersonal ignorance of it, and this impersonality allows us to try to clobber it without feeling responsible, because we don't know the other side personally. So it's easy to hate an enemy and clobber them, and you can then say, well, they were only Nazis, or they were the only commies, or they were only Catholics, or they were only materialists. It is that impersonal kind of thing where we can feel we can get away with it, perpetuate our projections. It's a way of distancing ourselves from intimate experience. And intimate experience is extremely important, because it is the only way that we can realize the dream. Because if the dream is an abstract picture, or if it isn't lived out in every little detail, it's nothing more than a fantasy, and there is no growth in it. We must give ourselves, we must repress ourselves totally to it. We have to surround every little bit of existence. In this regard, even eating is part of this war, because we can't even use food in our body unless we take it right down to the smallest level, break it down to a little bit, and overcome it and have it become part of our body. It's that kind of intimate experience. If we try to just have a blissful, a self-righteous and a self-justified existence by projecting a dream, even though that dream might even be a nightmare as well as a dream, because when we project the bad with the good, the ignorance with the knowledge, because otherwise it wouldn't be a dream. We can never hope to realize that dream if we try to abstain and remain aloof from it. True, we have said that Ormazd works not directly and not overpowering everything, and can remain as Ormazd, but his armies certainly enter into it, and so that's the only way that it can be done. Whether we like it or not, our adversaries and the dream and even the imperfect parts of it and the negative parts of it are projections of ourselves. They represent the ignorance we have. They represent the darkness that we have. This is easily seen in politics, where the left and the right complement each other, and they expose the ignorances and weaknesses of each other, and strengthen their own convictions by showing the fallacies in the other. Even this study that we're doing has the same thing. If you note, we keep switching from side to side to side to side. That this has been terribly frustrating all year, because dualism always has one more contradiction. And we can't fulfill the purposes of dualism until we do overcome all of those contradictions. We can only fulfill the purpose of the dream when we can unify the two opposites. What we're trying to get at, we're sort of dancing around here, and we're going to dance around a little bit for a few minutes, is the relationship of dualism or pluralism to unity, to monism, to the one. We somehow have to realize, in struggling back and forth and in bringing out all the weaknesses and strengths of the two sides or of the many sides, we have to come to the realization that they're all good, that there is goodness in all of the poles, and until we can bring that total goodness out and convert the darknesses into light, we can't be successful in realizing the dream. So if there's something we don't like, something that is uncomfortable to us, something that is annoying to us, or something that, especially something that we get peeved about, it's something that we have to give all the more of our attention to and to unify. Because in unity, we do accept our adversaries. And so there is in monism and dualism working together, one bringing the fulfillment, the other bringing out all of the minutiae, all of the details, all of the little things that were in ignorance or are in ignorance, bringing them all out until they can be seen or become something good. Now that's all sounds very pretty. Sounds like philosophy talk. In philosophy talk, especially in philosophy writing, you can write it down and make it sound like you've got all bases covered and it all sounds good, but reality is something different. If we took philosophy talk, we would have to say then that even war, not just the mythical war of Ahriman and Ormazd, but the Second World War, the Vietnam War, all the wars would be good. Good because they are an all-out effort, and good because they are an impersonal all-out effort with no subjectivism as part of them. If you're in a war, it certainly doesn't seem that way. If you're in some place like Bosnia, it certainly doesn't seem that way. But the reality of the matter is that initiates that have seen or can see the truth of the matter, in fact, say that very thing. They say that in our present state of evolution or lack of evolution, war is not only necessary, but that it is very good. In war, there is an urgency. In order for our cause, or what we think to be the right, to exist, and even for us to continue to exist, it requires an all-out effort. And as long as we have these negativities in ourselves, we're going to project them onto others, and there's going to be struggles. And since our consciousness is universal as well as individual and personal, there are going to be general conflicts as well as individual conflicts. There aren't going to just be little fightings in yourself. And as long as we are totally inspired, so that we have an inner fire of inspiration driving us to work on improvement and betterment in ourselves, if we don't have it within, then it's got to come from without. And we all know what a war effort is. In a war effort, a society gives everything it has. And on top of that, that society is very, very unified. Now, this is not said to take away from the atrocities or the pain and the suffering or anything like that. Those things, even in themselves, are motivating because they cause us to see what can happen if we let things get out of hand, or to see what can happen if we look with hatred on the other, without awareness and without seeing the light in another. And the last phrase, seeing the light in another, is where the crux comes out. When we struggle and suffer, and especially when we see other people suffer, what happens is the seeing of others suffering and awakening in ourselves a compassion to reach out to that suffering, that produces a commonality. That produces the beginnings of a monistic unity. We're still dancing around yet. Let's go back now and pick up. We're understanding a little bit now the relationship between dualism or pluralism and monism. And let's go back and pick up some of the other things that we started last time. We said that last time that once Ahriman acted, he had two very significant acts. The first was the tearing out of the womb first, and the second was the making of war. That once he acted, he sealed his own fate and became his own enemy, you might say. What happened, we said, was that once he acted, he was bound by the principle of action. And the principle of action is another name for cause and consequence, or of karma. See, once he had that pinpoint of light, and he acted on that pinpoint of light, he subjected himself to that light. And then he's hooked. He can't get away from it. He accepted the idea that if he acted, he could have what he wanted. If he acted, he could realize the capture of the light itself. And once he accepted the reality or the union of his action the cause as well as the consequences, then he was bound in time, because there's a difference between cause and consequence in time, and he was then bound in time into his actions. Sure, there's from the initial fall to the time of redemption, there are a lot of causes and consequences, but there is a consequential binding in time. Con meaning with, sequence meaning follows after. So consequential means a binding step by step in time, and it's literally that. So at this point, Ahriman is bound in space by his own nature, by his own negativity. Because what we call negative space is really positive space, and he's bound in negative space by his negativity of objectification. And he's bound in time by his actions, by the principle of consequence. What we're saying here is that there is a principle involved. That once there is an action, and that action gets united with causes, this action seems at first to congeal or to crystallize resistance or projected consciousness in the opposite, but that action produces eventually unification. Eventually, when the time becomes all and the action is subsumed in time, the action becomes a unifying activity. This is a thing that we see all the time. If we're having difficulty with someone, if we don't act or interact or even be belligerent with them, the situation cannot change. But as soon as we act, that acting in itself has to ultimately result in some kind of unification. Because we're in this together, even if it's a struggle. Paul knows all about this. Yes?
Before, like you were talking about war being outright, have some opponents or whatever. Well, what about ramifications or whatever when the people on one side start disagreeing with each other?
Yeah, that happens. But eventually, even no matter how much disagreement there is, as long as there is action and not withdrawal, ultimately there has to be unification. So what we're talking about here is a principle. And this is a principle which in its inverse is also true. If applying action, even bellicose action, results in unification, the opposite is true. If there is a breakdown of unity, there is a tremendous release of action, of energy, of force. We know this from the atomic bomb. Once you take a unity and divide it and separate it, what happens is there's a tremendous, tremendous release of energy.
Where's the energy from a divorce?
You've never been through a divorce. What?
Where does that energy go?
It just gets released. I don't want to go and talk about nuclear fission, because nuclear fission is actually another kind of differentiation, but in the material world there's so much differentiation that even unification seems like or a false unification seems like another form of differentiation. So there is a direct or a principled relationship between unity and duality. That when the dream is projected and when the one is intentionally divided, this releases an energy in the cosmos. When that energy is applied, be it constructively or destructively, that results in a reunification. And that the whole process of involution and evolution, or of separating into more and more discrete entities and then combining back until we are all united in the unity of spirit, that in this there is a very simple principle. It's a principle that we can use in ourselves. If we want to release energy and bring motive ability around, all we have to do is break something up. Or if we want to resolve or if we want to bring together opposites, all we have to do is bring them into war with each other. Of course, we have to remember in this that the time factor, the deeper the division, the longer the relationship there is between cause and consequence, and the time represents eternity. And so that if you're trying to unify yourself with somebody that is an outright enemy, and you might not see immediate results. What I'm trying to say, it may be several lives, and it may be several lives of really wanting to mix it up or having to mix it up. Now, yes.
So what you're implying is the process of war, or the action of war, is a process of awakening due to the contemplation that is caused by it, from it, through it, and why it happened and all of this, which eventually will bring about the unification.
Mm-hmm. Much, much quicker than if there isn't a war. Because if there isn't a war, we tend to sink back into our peaceful, so-called peaceful existence, and we don't do anything. We don't drive ourselves. We don't, we appease our differences or we mollify them. Now, ultimately, if we try to look at this exclusively in terms of dualism, this principle doesn't answer all of the contradictions of dualism. We have our picture as we once had it on the board, that if you looked at it from one perspective, it looked like a pyramid, and if you looked at it from the other perspective, it looked like a chute. In one case, it looked like you were looking down something, and in one case, it looked like you were looking up something. In either case, if you look at one separate difference, that is not resolved. But eventually, by flipping back and forth, you realize that there is a unity, that there is a connection, that the two are connected and bound by the same lines of consciousness that connect just like cause and consequence do. So it is if one person says, I'm sure that's a chute, and another person says, I'm sure that's a pyramid, that in each one trying to prove to the other that it is what they think it is, ultimately a unity is derived in. Every last little argument gets worked out. But if you want to persist in saying absolutely, if you want to persist in the dualism, that can never ever be successful. This brings up some very interesting types of questions that it first of all brings an appreciation that unity and duality or plurality are both absolutely necessary for creation, for the dream, and for all progress, even consciousness being conscious of consciousness.
Like the ultimate marriage is marrying somebody you hate.
Socrates thought so. And Socrates was successful in his lifetime. Socrates he said that if you're a philosopher, you should be able to live with anything. And so he intentionally married the biggest shrew in the city of Athens. Her name was Xantippe. And he was a good husband to her. And shrew though she was, she loved him. And she had to be very much restrained when he was going to die, because she felt so bad about it. It's clearly there has to be some balance of unity and difference. Questions come up. Can one realize unity without the experience of difference? I think not. I think a divinity that would live in some solipsistic self-satisfaction would have a very bland kind of existence. The opposite question that is very hard to ask is, can there be a duality without any realization of unity in it? I don't know how one would even begin to experience that. That's what we saw when we looked at early Zoroastrianism. That the only union that there was between Ahura Mazda and Andra Mainyu was the common destruction of things created. It wasn't like they even shared a common unity. I don't know. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. All right, these are very simple statements, very flat, almost horizontal statements about the relationship of unity and duality, or about unity and plurality. It's probably much, much more complex and much deeper than that. We will do a little bit of looking at that. That takes some effort on our part. When we look at war, or when we look at the things that are going on with childhood murders and things like that, probably the most repulsive and repugnant are immature acts of violence, senseless acts of violence. They seem almost random. That it's hard to understand why, with no purpose at all, somebody would just destroy something. I can remember walking down the street hanging out with the teenies when I was a kid, and this kid who was from town, but his parents sent him off to a wealthy parochial school, and he only came back in summers, and he came back as a man like I'm the hot shot. And we were walking down the street, about 4 of us, maybe 5. And he says, "Watch me jump over this bush." And he goes and he jumps right on the bush and shatters it. And even as a pretty much asleep teenager, I was just revolted by it. I've even got so I don't even like to see people walk across the grass if there's another walkway. But the opposite is something that is equally, the other direction is something equally important. People that impress us as being mature people, or developed people, or evolved people, what impresses us most is that they do things with purpose. There are purposeful actions. Now, if we take that among mere humans, and if we take that principle and take it all the way to the divine, it's like nothing in the cosmos is without purpose. And everything is deeply, deeply purposeful. So much so that with our mundane minds, where we can only, like little kids, if you're ever in a crowd, little children only notice things that are at a certain level. Anything that's above them, they don't notice that so much. And we see the world now, what is purposeful to us is only in terms of human things. If we try to look at it in terms of really divine things, the purposefulness is at a much, much higher level. So, in terms of Zervan, the chaotic one, when Zervan desires a son, this is not like you or I desiring a son to pride ourselves in or even to love. The amount of purpose that is in Zervan is enormous beyond our belief. It's like total purpose. Everything in the whole cosmos with all of its millions and billions of years of time approaching eternity. So it's very deep purpose. So when the children Oh, okay. So when we're talking about the projection of the dream, and we're talking about it in terms of a division with a release of energy that is like a big bang or like a cosmic shout, and then as that energy compounds back on itself, and there is an evolution in the struggle of unification, that there is a ponderous amount of energy, and that energy is proportionate to that purpose. So Zervan gives Zervan's all. And Ormazd, even though he does it reflectively, gives his all. And even Ahriman, in resistance or in negation or in violent opposition, gives his all. Now, because the projection of the dream is given with the all, everything is poured into it, it determines a limit. A positive limit. That is, the divine can go no further. It cannot condense, it cannot congeal the darkness or the dream or the ignorance, which is made of both the potential knowing and the darkness that is unknown. It is a positive limit. It goes this far and it goes no further. This makes, as we have seen before, the vertical dualism is not symmetric. That at the material, at the matter end, there is a limit. It can only go so far. It's the end of the line, and then things have to turn around. A negative limit is something like you can only go so far, because if you go any further, you would wreak harmful consequences. Positive limit is when you go so far, you can only go that far, and you have nothing left to give. I guess one could say then that something like eternal damnation would be something like a negative limit, like you go so far that you have lost even your wherewithal to come back. But so one might say that beyond the limit is the void. So it is an act of, it is the end and the exhaustion of the capacity of Zervan, of Ormazd, and of Arman, if they go as far as they can. So this is what it means, what is congealed in the potential of what could be in that dream, that the thing or the object quality of what could be congealed in that dream in space is called matter. It's the limitation of space. And there, Ahriman, as being the substance or being the consciousness of the limitation, is the limitation in space. Ormazd is compelled to give his all, because Ormazd and Ahriman are just about equal to each other. But in the act of Ormazd giving of himself totally, he realizes that he has to go beyond himself, and he draws on something within and beyond himself that could be a source of spiritual, of spirit that could be, which is another potential. And even though he acts in a reflectively projective way, he limits himself in time by being the spirit that could be, and this is open-ended. In short, at the other end of the spirit-matter pole, there is no limit to how far we can go in spirit. However, we cannot withdraw. We have to continuously be giving our all in reflective projection. If we just try to escape into the spirit, because we're bound on the spirit-matter pole, we'll have our nose rubbed into the, oh, I've had that happen so many times. I want to be all so spiritual, and I get my nose rubbed in the material world that in ways that you'd never believe. So we have then an asymmetrical vertical dualism. Zervan, when Zervan falls, he falls into a place with his doubt about whether he could or couldn't do something. He sinks into the background, and his energy is passed to Ormazd. But in effect, this is really another way of saying where Ormazd is drawing his energy from. It's that same background that Zervan is in. When something is invisible, it's something that is more subtle. And he's sinking into the absolute, or he's sinking, it's like his creative work is done, and he can withdraw from the active manifestation and become even more subtle, and henceforth even more powerful. So his invisibility really isn't, this is why the first principle of Trinity in all societies is always invisible. In a lot of societies, the triangle that represented the divine was open at the top, and they had like a fire. I'm sure it's a symbol that you've seen a number of times, a triangle, a pyramid with only a fire at the top and nothing distinct. So, what we're saying is that this whole process of going beyond oneself to have an energy, and to have an energy to reconcile opposites or to reconcile differences, is a general principle. It's a general principle that works throughout the cosmos. And this is why the limitation in time, saying there is an ideal. Because an ideal isn't a reality. The ideal is something, a potential way that we could act from. And that when we live according to an ideal, we go beyond ourselves and we raise ourselves and we get the strength to tackle the things that we need to tackle in everyday living. And so what we're talking about in the struggle of Ormazd and Ahriman is something that takes place in our lives every day. And even though it may sound like it's just kid stuff to think of Pollyanna ideals, it really is there. It really is there. So when Ormazd binds himself in time, that means that time is a potential of a goodness that could be, which is like a description of a transcendent ideal. And that's how he accomplishes what he accomplishes. But he doesn't remain, he individually is not bound up in the warfare, but does it impersonally through the reflective projection. He has sacrificed himself, and because he has sacrificed himself or repressed himself, he has drawn on the divine creative power of repression, which brings one into the absolute, and in so doing, he has created a responsibility. And by fulfilling that responsibility is how he can get beyond himself. So like Ormazd is actually no different than Zervan of sacrificing himself and becoming more than he was in the process. In a way, Ahriman sacrifices himself in a battle, but it shows you his is the kind of sacrifice like you have in checkers, where you sacrifice one piece in hopes to get two. And it's not the kind of sacrifice that is a sacrifice that is of giving. All right. Ahriman is actually the embodiment of the dream, the shadow side of it, the incomplete side of it, the unknown side of it. It is the realization of his limitation. So now we have both Ormazd and Ahriman bound in their consciousness in time. And because they share this same potential, each one seeing it in a different way, but it's still the same potential, the potential of time, they are locked in a combat, and they have to be combating with each other. The moral of the story is that because they are locked in this same potential, and every action that they take realizes that potential, that no matter how grim things are for us, no matter how hard what we have to deal with, we must be able to overcome anything, any struggle that we are involved in, especially if we happen to have things in the right perspective, the Ormazdic perspective, and we're not looking with our Ahrimanic selfish materialistic thought, but if we're thinking in terms of the realization of the dream, and if we're thinking of the manifestation of ideals and of getting better, we have to succeed. There is no way that we can fail. And so that in ourselves, like me, I sometimes have difficulty with wanting to be lazy at work. If I persist in the Armageddon, if I persist in the struggle, there's no way but that I can do anything but succeed. I'm a little bit far away from the notes here, but that's all right. We'll just have a different talk than the one I intended. Yeah. So basically what we're saying in a really simple way is that impersonal self-sacrifice leads to ultimate accomplishment. That there is no way that we can do anything but succeed. If we choose the other kind of sacrifice, the strifeful, harmonic sacrifice, it succeeds, at least in terms of Ormazd, it succeeds, though it's a much more painful and destructive kind of way, and one is trying to have the illusion lead the reality rather than the reality lead the illusion. All right, now let's move on to the last little bit that we have, and then we're going to be finished with Mazdaism and Zervanism. We've been saying all along, for several years now, we've been trying to be honest about our state of consciousness, and we've been saying that we're really materialists. We think of things in terms of objects with beginnings and ends, and to some extent we are locked in an harmonic outlook, and we have all kinds of illusions about things. And we've said right on from the very beginning when we started talking about Mazdaism, we said that one of these illusions, and it's the way the story has to be told, is that Ormazd makes war. It really isn't true. Ormazd struggles intensely and struggles intimately, but he really doesn't make war. He doesn't want to destroy something because that would be out of his character. But seen from the viewpoint of materialism and the harmonic consciousness, it looks like war. At this end of the asymmetric spirit-matter pole, things do have ends. At the spirit end, they don't. They're always open-ended. Here, things are not only binding, but they're bound. And this leads to a misunderstanding of dualism. If we don't have the spiritual unity, if we don't have the coalescent quality of monism that works together with dualism or pluralism, we have a great misunderstanding, and we can't understand the true nature of what we're living in. It's only when we free ourselves from the harmonic, deathly kind of consciousness that we can really see it. We find a lot of examples of this, even in the Bible. Jehovah is described or is self-defining and saying, I am that I am. And it's a pretty limited kind of statement. It doesn't talk anything about eternity or anything like that. Some other conceptions of divinity are even more limiting and material, in fact, human-like. These are examples of materialistic conceptions. This is the definitive, the dead end, looking at dualism that has frustrated us either this way. We know that people who are insecure, people who are slaves, that are bound by their own immature and limited characters, that's exactly what they try to do. They try to be like Ahriman, and they make demands. They say it has to be either this way or that way, without any potential of without even potentially looking at the unity where the two could be seen as one. The harmonic materialistic consciousness, because since only one object can occupy space in this material at one time, it becomes an exclusive kind of consciousness, either this or this. And there isn't a trying to compromise, there isn't a trying to reach beyond into a kind of unity. This kind of an outlook about dualism is very limiting, and a lot of people have made comment about it. Lao Tzu, for example, seems to reject it, but you have to be very careful about the way he says it. Lao Tzu says, in effect, if you make a good man by the same action, you have made a bad man. And even though his dualism, his Taoism, where everything is within the Tao, it is the two opposites are always within the circle, the yin-yang circle, which we probably should be pronounced Jin-Jang, I don't know. Bob is insulted by my horrible Westernisms of it all. If you have things outside of the circle of unity, you have things like good men and bad men. So there is the kind of fallacy of thinking that you have a good and a bad, and you have a right and a wrong, and that fallacy goes so far that it is actually a logical fallacy. And it's something we haven't talked about yet. The fallacy is thinking that good is the opposite of evil. And it shouldn't even be there in the strictest Mazdaism, because Ahriman is the spirit of negation that is not, never was, and never again will be. The logical opposite, which also happens to be the Mazdasm opposite of good, is not good. You apply the negative. Sharad says, I recognize that. You can't say that X is the opposite of Y. You can say that X is not Y. So there is, when you say that something is not good, you're saying something very different from saying that something is evil. If something is not good, it could be evil, but it could also be a lot of other things. It could be neutral things, or it could be indifferent things. The outlook where you use logical opposites, good and not good, is very open-ended. It doesn't have just a good man and an evil man. It's more Mazdic. It's open-ended. It's not limited like Ahriman that says this is what a thing is. It's evil. That's the first thing that we do with things that we don't like and things that we really don't want to come to terms with. We call them names, right? We say, bam, you're that. And the intention is to lock so that there's not even any time, so that they're going to be that throughout time and that there's no interaction so that there can be any progress. But when you say the opposite of good is not good, it's so open-ended that it's an anything kind of goes world. In fact, so much so that you could even leak out the side and go into an aethical or an unethical or non-ethical relativism. Things are so wide open. However, intuition and experience, even without ratiocination, bring us to the realization that there are priorities in reality. Some things are more important than others, and some things are better than others. But when we start talking that way, we're using a different kind of language. We're not saying some things are good and some things are bad. We're saying that some things are better. Some things are more important. And that gets us out of the name-calling. That gets us out of the Ahrimanic limitation where we call things good and evil. We still have the reality, the priority, the significance of a vertical dualism, but it is continuous. It's like the spirit. It's continuous. It goes all the way from something being very limited to something having a lot of goodness. Not that it's good, but it has a lot of goodness. There's always an improvement, because there's no end to where you can go. Ideals in spirit are like that. Ideals are something that the horizon recedes as we approach it. The better we become about things, the more we're able to love, the more capacity we have to see that there could be even more love. And when we see that kind of potential, then we can continue to improve. In spirit, when we see improvement in time, when we see progress, when we experience not only intuitively, but in a way that it is reasonable that our lives are better, we really do become conscious. We're intimate with our lives. We're responsible in our lives, and the quality of our life is better. It is, as not only Zarathustra, but all of the spiritual teachers that have come to help us have realized that we are lagging most in our moral and ethical development. It doesn't take even but a very cursory examination of any religion to see that the emphasis is not on material satisfaction. The emphasis is not on science or anything of that nature. The emphasis is always on improvement, because there is where we are out of time, where there is not a controlled and comprehensive connection between cause and consequence. We do things that we would like just as soon not have any consequences to. And we spent a whole year last year talking about evil being out of time. And it means that we need to get back into time, and every effort that has been given to help us has stressed the moral and the ethical teachings. This says that those who have more purpose, that can live and experience purpose, set before us from their life and from their intention and from their focus the idea and the ideal that we can live better lives. And this is what we're looking at in terms of the struggle, in terms of the Armageddon. We can overcome the harmonic negativity by keeping our consciousness on an open-ended, how could this be better? We cannot avoid not good, which is absurdly negative. We cannot shun evil, because if we shun evil, then we are not fulfilling our responsibility. We're denying. We're not living out, or we're not realizing the dream. What we have to do is, by looking at ideals, we have to bring light to things that are light in life, to things that are now dead. That is to say, what happens when Gosh the ox becomes fertilizer for new life, or Gaelmart, the ideal perfect man, dies and is destroyed. It becomes fertilizer for a whole realm of kings. This is exactly what Ormazd does in the story. He brings light, and has all of the first creators, all of the first creatures see how beautiful things are, how good things are, and how they have indeed come from the light. But in order to do this, Ormazd has to go beyond himself, within himself, and he doesn't limit himself in space, because if he limited himself in space, it would have to be a constantly expanding universe that stayed only as one big behemoth bloated thing. But what happens is that as the Ormazdic consciousness realizes the dream and we intimately love each and every little part of it, it happens exactly as it does in digestion. Things are broken down and the general health of the body is restored and built up and strengthened. And so it is both a minute, intimate breakdown and an overall breakdown. In the cosmic creation, as the material is dissolved by acts of love, as matter is spiritualized through a process of vigorous interaction and withdrawing the essence from it, space collapses until at the end of the entire cosmos, everything collapses back into an unspeakable unity. It's a tricky process. It's tricky because it is both a reflection from both sides and a projection. We see this in that the devas, in their character and in their capacity, are not evil, but they are mirror reflections of the Amshashpins. And they are, just like our apparent enemies are, they are projections, reverse projections of our own darkness and our own negativity. We can get all bound up in the world of the devas. We can get all bound up in nature and in matter. But if we look beyond, if we look through, the same drawing, the same going within ourselves and going beyond ourselves is what allows us to get within. It's more than a surrounding of the devas. It's more than a surrounding of all of the adversaries of Ormazd. It is an actually getting within them and permeating them that allows the great resurrection to take place. Till we get to the point that we are no longer projecting, but that everything that we are doing is reflecting, which is what a kind of absorbing memory is. It's a memory of the original dream. It's a memory of all of the experience. When that takes place in that reflective kind of consciousness, we are doing everything while giving the appearance of doing nothing. To quote Lao Tzu, so that is when we come to the Ormazdic kind of consciousness, that magical consciousness, where we do things by reflection more than by projection, we can accomplish things and fulfill that way. I guess I don't have a whole lot more to say. I think we've got the basic principles and ideas of the relationship now between unity and duality, and how they complement each other and how they're necessary to each other, and how they are part of an ongoing activity that must be ongoing, and that is not purposeless, but is just the opposite of purposelessness, so that if the next time you run into somebody who gives you the cosmological argument and says that an infinite regression of cause and consequences is meaningless, it's only meaningless because you don't have the spirit to go beyond or the purpose to go within and beyond. I hope we have some practical ideas that have come out of Mazdaism and Zervanism, and next time we'll look at Manichaeism, which is practical if you're very strong. And we'll look at one more kind of dualism and try to tie together the whole year's worth in one sentence and then shut up for half a year again. No questions. All right. Thank you.
I have a question.
All right.
Is this meant as an allegory? And where do we fit into the cycles?
It is, you mean the story that we're looking at?
Yes.
The story is exactly like a play within a play in Shakespeare. That when there is a play within a play, it helps one to realize different levels of experience. Because you can see what's going on in a play, and that then helps you to see your life in a bigger sphere. And if you're really lucky, it helps you to see what your life is part of. And so there is something, it's like saying that when Ormazd overcomes Ahriman, and each little particle, each little bit, even if it's figurative, of the dream is overcome, that means that the macrocosm, the Ormazdic consciousness, gains from each one of those things, all the way up the line. And so the principle of analogy is not only the way that things are kept together in a unity, it is how the consciousness is realized in the whole creative process. So it is a story about reality, which in itself we're calling a dream that is being realized. And the story gives us the essence of the principle, so that, not that we think about slaughtering an enemy in a warfare, but so that by seeing how it is done, that we can use it in our lives, and then we consciously become like Ormazd. We become like God, because, eventually the whole microcosm, macrocosm, or a play within a play, consciousness collapses on itself, and this is the way the one becomes more of the one, is by this same realization extending it beyond itself. It's like Ormazd not only backs out of the dream while by radiating light into it, but Ormazd backs out of the cosmos and backs into a greater reality in the void by going beyond itself.
So it becomes, in a sense,
God becomes more God by being God to God. Yeah.
And in a sense, the Zurvan, the story of Ormazd and Ahriman is a story of everything that happens within ourselves, as though we are Zurvan.
Yes. Yes. And Ormazd actually follows the whole path of Zurvan. Zurvan, even though he's so-called false, actually shows the pathway of transcending beyond into a more invisible kind of sphere, and that's exactly what Ormazd has to do in order to conquer. Ormazd, what's really beautiful, like if you listen to music in string quartets, because they have so few instruments, it's like looking through a window at a landscape of the mind. And when you have somebody like Beethoven, there's no glass in the window. It's like you're looking like straight into the creative mind. And I'm having a hard time holding my thought together here. What really makes great people great is that they can shed their light or do what they do without any self getting in the way to filter the light. And that repression and sacrifice of self is what makes that wondrous state of being or being of being possible. And that's the kind of principle I've been trying to get at the whole night. But it was a dancing kind of time while making the notes and while giving the talk, sort of dancing around the point. Yeah. That in fact is exactly true, because sometimes thinking about how you're going to say what you're going to say gets in your own way. And if you're concerned about how you're going to do things, you're involved in the appearances rather than in the reality. I agree.
Trying to realize that purpose can get in the way too.
Not if the purpose goes beyond you.
So don't try to realize it.
What?
So then don't try to realize it.
I didn't go into that side there. There are people that live by that philosophy too. That's sometimes a misunderstanding, but I don't know how complete.
I realize I don't mean carry it out, I mean understand.
Yeah. But what you're talking about there is a kind of what some people call an active negativism, which is a kind of philosophy that comes from an alternative interpretation of Taoism. It's the dualism. It can keep you going forever and ever, I guess. Well, thank you very much. See, we didn't even.